microphone or no microphone, just let us know.
Okay. Can you hear me in the back if I speak like this?
Sure.
Okay. Nice to talk without amplification, I think. So, but if I start to flag and you can't hear me, please raise your hand and let me know, and we can get some help. Anyway, it's a huge pleasure to be here, and independent bookstores are really important and have been important in my life. So I'm glad to see people out supporting them. And I thought I would just speak for a very brief time, 10 or 15 minutes, about just to tell you a little bit about who I am, why I do what I do, and a little bit about the background to this new book of mine. And then I'd love to answer questions. I think most of the people who come to events like this want to know very particular things, and so I'm happy to answer whatever questions you've got. So I started out not intending whatsoever to write about the science of cooking. I was interested in astronomy, and I went to the California Institute of Technology from Illinois to study astronomy. And so to end up writing about the chemistry of cooking might seem like quite a stretch, although it turns out all you have to do is put a G in front of astronomy, and that's where I ended up. So not such a stretch. What happened was that I decided after a few years of Feynman physics and math and chemistry and so on that I was still really interested in astronomy and science in general. I just didn't want to do it for 12 hours a day and do it in the way that it was being done at that time. This is now the early 70s, which meant standing in line to use the one campus or not even a supercomputer, just a big computer that served everyone, and we had to use punch cards. If you remember that, it was just not fun. And so I thought, okay, I'm really interested in the ideas, the emotions that those ideas evoke in science, and so I'm going to switch and shift to philosophy and literature. And I was ready to transfer from Caltech, but my teachers there in the humanities department said, you know, we don't have a whole lot of students here, and if you stick around, we'll give you a really good education. And so I did that, and they did. They essentially gave me tutorials for the last 2 years of my life, my career there, one-on-one classes. Amazing. And what that meant was I could cherry pick the science courses.
You're speaking softer and softer.
Okay, so harder to hear me? Okay, let's. Okay, is that better?
Right.
Good. So I stayed at Caltech, and I was able to cherry pick the science courses, to take the ones that really interested me, which was fantastic, and actually great preparation for what I ended up doing. So then I went off, did a graduate degree in literature, and wrote a PhD dissertation called Keats and the Progress of Taste, but a different kind of taste. And then started teaching, but I was only able to get year-to-year contracts. I was never able to get a tenure track position. And after a few years of that kind of frustration and uncertainty, I thought, well, I've been teaching my students, among other things, writing, how to write effectively. And I haven't been doing a lot of writing myself. Maybe I should try to practice what I've been teaching, and maybe go back to that investment I made in science and write about science. The problem was that Stephen Hawking was writing about the universe, and Lewis Thomas, I don't know if any of you remember him, but he was writing wonderful essays about biology and medicine. So I looked around and I thought, well, you know, nobody's really writing about the science of everyday life, just the things that happen around us every day, and that are very interesting the more you know about them. And cooking, to me, was the closest thing to a laboratory that those of us who aren't scientists work in every day. It's a place where we take natural materials and we transform them into something interesting. And we, in a way, do experiments because we do things differently, a little bit differently, or we try something new, try a new recipe. It's, and the transformations that do take place are really interesting. I also had a friend who encouraged me, and I tell this story in the book, in Keys to Good Cooking. A friend who, when he heard that I was contemplating this possibility, he said, "Okay, I've got a question for you. I'm from New Orleans. I love red beans and rice, but I can only eat one serving without suffering. So what is it about beans that gives me gas? And is there a chart that will tell me which beans are more forgiving than others? And if not, is there something I can do to make them more forgiving?" And so I went to the library to see if an answer existed on that particular subject, and was amazed not only to find that yes, there was an answer to that question, but that most of the research had been funded by NASA. And if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. Tom Wolfe, The Right Stuff, there's actually a chapter about the tests involved, because you could, as an astronaut candidate, you could wash out if you happen to be unfortunately productive in certain respects. So anyway, I realized that there was some really interesting stuff there that wasn't generally known. For whatever reason, the science of cooking had never really been explained for the general reader, for cooks. There was a lot of information available in the manufacturing literature, the food science literature. And I was kindly introduced as a food scientist. I'm really not. Food science is a PhD program, a specialty profession. I'm a writer who's really interested in food science, and what I try to do is take food science and translate it into English so that the rest of us can appreciate it and make use of it. So I saw that there was this kind of treasure trove of information that had never been translated for the average reader, the cook, and I decided that's what I would try to do. And was lucky that very early on a publisher heard about that, was interested enough in it to invite me to lunch to talk about it. And at the time I was thinking, well, this would be just a fairly practical book. This is how eggs behave, and this is how you want to scramble eggs and fry eggs, and so on and so on. But in the process of doing the research, I discovered that the way people cook has changed, of course, over the years, and there's some very interesting transitions that have taken place, for example, in the cooking of meat. And that meat was cooked one way until the middle of the 19th century, and then it changed completely thanks to the influence of one particular man. And so I told this publisher this story. I didn't really have any written material to show him yet, because it was still kind of an idea. But I told him that story about this chemist in the 19th century who changed the way Europeans and Americans cooked meat. And at the end of the lunch, he said, "I like this idea. I think you're the right guy to write it. So I'm going to send you a contract. I want you to consider it, and I want to publish your book. But if I publish your book, it's not going to be just a practical book. It has to include things like that story you told me about the chemist who changed the way people cook meat. I want each chapter to be a kind of rounded picture of that ingredient or that technique." And so it was actually an enlightened publisher who kind of set me on the track to write the kind of book that I did on food and cooking. And that was, I mean, the book world has changed a lot over the last few decades, publishing included, and there are, I think, very few publishers like that still around. This was Charles Scribner Jr., whose father was the publisher of Hemingway, Fitzgerald, Thomas Wolfe, just an amazing group of American writers. So it was a real privilege to be involved with a family and a company with that kind of history. By the time my book came out, it was no longer a family business. Anyway, so that's the book I wrote on food and cooking, which does try to give a kind of rounded portrait of these ingredients, the kind of cultural history, natural history, as well as the chemistry and actually what happens in cooking. So the reason I've done this new book is that a lot of cooks, professional and otherwise, have appreciated on food and cooking, but have said, when I'm frying an egg and something goes wrong, or when I'm making a brioche and something goes wrong, and I want to understand what happened, and I'm in the kitchen working, it takes me forever to find the right page, because you've got all this other stuff in there, the cultural history, the rounded stuff. And so that got me to thinking, okay, maybe there's reason to kind of take the practical information and condense it to make it more practical, more easily found. And then I began to notice the increasing, I guess you'd call it fashionability of including scientific explanations these days. You know, how the science of cooking, which when I started writing, not that many people were interested in. Happily for me, now there are a lot of people interested in it, but what that means is that a lot of people are putting pseudoscientific explanations into their cookbooks or into magazine articles or on television in an attempt to sort of satisfy that interest in readers and viewers to understand how things work and why things are done a certain way. But often that information is not good. It's not reliable because the homework hasn't been done to really understand what's going on. Foods are really complicated, and when I'm asked questions, the most common answer I give is I don't know, because there's just so much to understand about food and cooking. So seeing all this kind of bad information out there in recipe books, I decided that maybe there would be a good reason to write a book that would be not a recipe book, but a book that contained the basic principles of cooking practically, from a practical perspective, and meant to be used in the kitchen in the process of cooking when you're having a problem, or when you're choosing which recipe to use, or when you're about to try a method or an ingredient that you haven't worked with before. So that's what I've tried to do in Keys to Good Cooking, is condense what is known, and is known solidly, about what ingredients are, how cooking techniques work, what sorts of recipes work, what sorts of recipes don't work, what to look for in recipes of a particular kind, and all laid out so that when you're looking through the pages, your eye will fall on the key words which are highlighted in blue to save you trouble and to save you time, so that in the middle of cooking you can find the information quickly and then close the book and get on with the job. On Food and Cooking is more of a browsing book, a reading book. This is more a guidebook, a handbook that's meant to help you every day. So that's the brief story of this book, and as I said, I'd be happy to answer any questions you have about the book, about food and cooking, about cooking, things that have come up in your kitchen recently, this peculiar experimental cooking that is getting a lot of attention in magazines and newspapers these days, whatever you like. Yes?
I have a question about, you have people pair wine with food. Says, what is the process that takes place that makes that taste of it? Is the food influencing the wine, or is the wine bringing up the flavor to the food?
That's a really good question. The next book that I'm going to write is not about wine and food pairing, but it's about flavor. Because to me, that's the most interesting thing about food and cooking. What is it that makes those wonderful sensations, and how do we get such pleasure out of them? So come January, when I'm done with this book tour, that's exactly what I'm going to steep myself in, that very question. So the question is wine pairing and what's happening. You know, is the wine influencing the flavor of the food, or vice versa? And many books have been written about pairing foods with wines, and if you look at the the scientific literature on that question and ask, is there anything there other than just kind of particular people saying, I like this and this together, and therefore it's a good pairing. The only experiments that have been done have found that if you ask, for example, with cheese, which wines go best with which cheeses, and then you do the experiments, pair different wines with different cheeses, and then have people rank the flavors of and describe the flavors of the wines and the cheeses. Basically what you find out is whenever you eat any food with wine, it diminishes your perception of the wine. And whenever you drink wine with food, it diminishes your perception of the food. So it seems to be that the real principle is how do you not do harm to your experience of the other pair, the other member of the pair. And then you have to ask, okay, which is more important to me, the wine or the food in this context? You know, if I've got a special bottle of wine, then I'm going to want to prepare something that's fairly plain, so as not to really change the flavor of the wine that much. If you've made a very special meal, then maybe you want to have a wine that's not going to compete with its own flavors. So that, you know, you can't really pin a book on on a finding like that, but that seems to be the scientific understanding of wine pairing at the moment. At the very back.
We're talking about other shows and articles that have science. I like watching Good Eats with Alton Brown. So if you're familiar with his shows, do you think his science is good?
His science is good, and he's actually done me the favor frequently of opening his show, showing him flipping through my book, and then closing it and getting up and explaining things. So he does his homework, and I think he's brilliant at taking sometimes, you know, difficult ideas and presenting them in a very concrete and often funny way that makes them memorable. So I think he's a great educator. Yeah. Yes?
Is microwave cooking safe or good?
Microwave cooking. So microwaves have a bad reputation because we often hear about microwave radiation, and radiation always gives us pause. Turns out that if you go out on a sunny day and hold your hand in the sun, what you feel is radiation from the sun. And that's what's going on in the microwave oven. It's not the kind of radiation that leaves things radioactive, it's the radiation that transmits energy from one place to another. And it turns out microwaves are actually really, really efficient because they can actually penetrate into foods a certain distance. They don't cook from the inside out, which some people have said, but they do cook into a food, and that makes microwaves cook very quickly because you don't have to wait for the heat to get from the outside to the inside. And especially for vegetables, that's a wonderful thing because the faster you bring vegetables up to the boiling point, the more of their vitamins you preserve. So for cooking vegetables, and studies from all over the world have repeatedly found this, you end up with many more vitamins in vegetables than you do boiling, steaming, sauteing, you name it. Microwaves do the best job. With things like meats and fish, they're a little more difficult because it's not as easy to control the heating. With those foods, you want to heat gently and precisely to a very particular temperature, and that's much more difficult to do with the microwave than with conventional heat sources. Yes?
I just looked through your 3 books, the index. Why do we scald milk? You don't seem to answer that.
Well, it depends on the context. If you're making yogurt, for example, or if you're making an ice cream, scalding will essentially, milk is a very hospitable environment for microbes, and scalding will essentially knock out whatever bugs are growing in the milk at that point. In the case of yogurt, you want to do that partly to give the yogurt bacteria more of a leg up on the fermentation, but also it turns out that scalding changes the proteins of the milk in such a way that you end up with a yogurt that doesn't leak so much whey. So you end up with a more even, kind of thick texture. But often it's simply to, certainly in the case of ice creams, because you're not going to be cooking the material otherwise. You're doing it for safety purposes. There is also in baking, in the past, people have found that there's certain baking processes in which milk proteins can interfere with the rising of a dough unless you scald the milk. Recently, people have said that that's really not the case anymore, maybe because the pasteurization temperatures have gone up and the milk is heated more in the initial processing. But that's another instance in which it's been scalded.
I have a question. Could you tell me about garlic? What happens to garlic when you roast it, fry it, becomes bitter? What's the chemical situation?
Okay, the question is what's going on with garlic? And so garlic and onions both are vegetables that generate very pungent, noticeable aromas when their tissue is damaged. And that happens because the plant does this in order to discourage animals and creatures like us from eating them. We've found reasons to like them in any case, but they're defensive reactions, and they take place when the tissue is damaged. And what happens is that there are kind of unloaded weapons, chemical weapons in the cell being held in storage for an eventuality like this. And when the tissue is damaged, those weapons come into contact with an enzyme that essentially arms them, and then they generate these very smelly compounds. And that's meant to deter us. Also, they're pungent, so they burn the tongue. So you get the most of those very pungent, strong-smelling effects when you crush the tissue the most. So if you take an onion or a piece of garlic and you puree it, or you pound it into a pulp, then you end up with a tremendous amount of flavor. If you just slice it, you get less. And if you slice it and rinse the slices so that the chemical weapons are washed off, then you essentially have intact tissue without much of those aromas, and you'll only get them when you then bite into them. And your teeth then do the damage. So if you're making a salsa, for example, it's a really good idea after you chop the onions and garlic to rinse them off, because that'll get rid of those strong aromas that will eventually kind of turn not so nice after they sit around for a while. Then cooking is a different issue, because when you cook these plants, these vegetables, cooking will essentially destroy the enzymes that arm the chemical weapons. And if you do that, then you don't end up with those pungent flavors. And so roasting garlic actually makes it very mellow, because you take the intact clove, heat it, and by heating it, you destroy the enzymes, and then what you're left with is something that ends up being very mild by comparison. And same with onions.
You say for a pick of onions, if refrigerating the onion, would that diminish the potency of the onion?
Refrigerating an onion is a great idea if you're about to cut it, because refrigeration will do two things. It makes the reaction of the enzyme with the chemical weapon much slower, because the temperature is lower, and it also makes whatever is produced by the interaction of those two much less volatile, because it's chilled down. And so the combination of those two things means that if you chop a cold onion, you end up with much less tearing than you do if you just use it in the temperature onion.
When using like starches, whether it's tapioca, potato, or just flour or cornstarch, what is the reasoning behind what says this starch is going to be good with this product, as opposed to, like, say, what kind of starch would work well with an ice cream to, if you don't want to add a bunch of sugar or a bunch of fat to it, to make the chicken ice cream, or like, where would you use certain different kinds of starches, and what
different starches and different applications, tapioca, potato, cornstarch, flour, and nowadays people are using starch-like materials from seaweeds, alginates and agar-agar and things like that. And you're right, these all have different properties. You need different amounts of them to do the thickening, so you need a fair amount of flour to thicken a cup of water. You need much less cornstarch, and you need much less than that of these alginates and agar-agar. So that's one thing. They have different flavors. You need different amounts of them. They end up with different textures. Some of them are very long molecules, and so they tend to produce a kind of stringy consistency if they're too concentrated. Others are much more smooth and creamy. So it kind of depends on what it is you're making and what sort of effect you're looking for. In an ice cream in particular, well, you can make ice creams of different kinds with all of them. The Sicilians, for example, typically use cornstarch to make their ice creams. Use much less cream, in fact, often none whatsoever, just milk and cornstarch and maybe one egg or something. There's a way of getting a smooth texture without using expensive ingredients, perishable ingredients. But you can tell that it's a cornstarch ice cream and not a cream-based ice cream.
You take it too far if you want to thicken it up when you burn the starch, you're going to do with absolute taste. If you don't cook it out long enough, you're left with a real corn stage, a real tapioca taste. But is like, what's the fine line that you have to work with?
Well, it's going to vary from starch to starch and application as well. I mean, chocolate, for example, will cover a lot of flavors, and you don't have to worry so much about it. But plain vanilla ice cream is going to be much more delicate. Yeah. Yes.
Is there a consensus about cooking oils, like olive oil or other kinds of oils and their healthiness?
Cooking oils. So my next New York Times column, coming out a week from tomorrow, it was going to be tomorrow, but they delayed it, is about cooking oils. And of course, there are very different aspects of cooking oils. There's flavor, there's healthfulness, cost. It would be nice if we could all use super premium olive oils, but they cost more than $1 a tablespoon. And canola oil, soy oil, safflower, sunflower are about a dime a tablespoon. So that's just a very basic consideration. And then it turns out this article that I wrote has more to do with flavor. What happens to the flavors of oils when they get heated, and essentially they all end up tasting about the same. And it turns out that refining oils, most seed-based oils are refined. Olive oil is generally not refined. The refining process includes heating. And what happens when you heat an oil is that you essentially drive out the aromatic molecules that it contains, so that it ends up with a more neutral aroma. So when you cook with an oil that's seen as very aromatic, that's partly because all the aroma is being lost into the air, and what's left in the food itself is not that aromatic at all. And then health is a very different issue, and there are different aspects to that. So is the oil more or less saturated? Is the oil, does it have more or less of the omega-3s that seem to be especially important? Do they have antioxidants? Do they have polyphenols? These are all, and different oils have different combinations. They offer different packages of these healthful aspects. There are lots of things to think about, and if it is a question that interests you, I think you have to kind of start from first principles. What's important to you as a consumer? Is how important is price, because that's going to make a big difference. And then beyond that, what country does it come from, or Is it mass produced or artisanally produced? And do you want more omega-3s so that you eat less fish, or do you want more vitamin E? Or those are the kinds of considerations. Yes.
Yeah, can you talk about the chemical, you were mentioning the chemical process of refining those oils. Can you talk about, because I was reading an article that there were some caustic substances that are used to refine many of those oils. So could you talk about that process, and are we really getting the truth from the government watchdogs about how caustic those substances are?
Well, oils are, it's not that caustic substances are used, but solvents are used to remove things from the oil that we don't want in the oil. So if you crush canola seeds, for example, or soybeans, and just drain off the oil tastes awful and spoils pretty quickly because it's got lots of other stuff from the seed besides the oil itself. So refining is essentially taking this mixture of materials and eliminating everything that isn't just pure oil. And to do that, you heat to get rid of some things, and then you use solvents essentially to remove the other stuff that you don't want. And the solvents are, they're not things that you would want to eat.
Right, I heard they said it was similar to like gasoline on some of these solvents.
Well, yeah, but like gasoline in the same way that alcohol is like gasoline. I mean, alcohol is like gasoline chemically in that respect. So the real question is, what residues of the solvents are left in the oil? And there are very strict standards about that. And to my knowledge, there have been some major scandals in Europe to do with cooking oils, and in fact, dozens of people have died from adulterated oils in Europe. But that's not happened here. So, for whatever reason, I think we're yeah.
Well, my next question would be, how are you gonna cook your turkey?
Well, that's a switch.
I heard you on NPR. Why don't you tell them how your trick for turkey?
Okay, yeah. So the challenge of cooking a turkey is the basic challenge. There are many little challenges, but the basic one is that you have two very different kinds of meat on the same bird. One that is very delicate and lean, and you want to cook it very carefully to a relatively low temperature, maybe 150 degrees. That's the breast meat. And then the leg meat has connective tissue, it has fat. You want to cook it to a higher temperature, maybe 165, 170. And 175 wouldn't hurt. Essentially you want to cook the same bird in the same oven to two different temperatures at the same time, and that's tough. So there are various things you can do to make that happen, and one of them is to take the bird out several hours ahead of time and clean it off, set it out on a rack, and just let the legs flop open and let the legs warm up to room temperature or close to it. But in the meantime, take a couple of Ziploc bags and fill them with ice, crushed ice, and put those on the breast. And that keeps the breast at refrigerator temperature while the legs are warming up.
Is this proven? Have you tried this, or?
Yeah. That's what I do every year. And it does conjure a strange picture, especially when I tell you that because the skin of the turkey breast is slippery, and a Ziploc bag is slippery, so you have to do something to hold it in place. I use an ace bandage. You end up creating a temperature differential between the breasts and the legs ahead of the cooking, so that when you put it in the oven, the legs are already 20, 30 degrees ahead of the breasts, and that's exactly where you want them, because you want to cook the legs to a hotter temperature than you do the breast. And then you can do things like, it's really important to keep track of the temperatures of those two parts, and if the breast is getting close to being done, then you put a tent of foil over it to slow down the heat radiation from the surfaces of the oven. You can baste it with liquid, which also slows down the heating. So there are various things you can fiddle with, but for me, the best way to kind of get a good head start on the problem is chilling the breasts.
Are you a fan of brining?
I'm not a fan of brining, no.
Because it doesn't work to your satisfaction, or just because it's too much work?
Brining a turkey, brining any kind of lean meat does make it juicier. But it makes it juicier essentially because you're filling it with salty tap water. And I think it's better to cook the meat carefully and just have meat juices. And the other thing is, you know, you end up with turkey meat that tastes like delicatessen turkey meat. You know, it doesn't taste like roasted turkey meat. And for me, the real deal killer is that you can't use the pan juices to make pan juices and gravy. They're so salty that you essentially have to dilute them so much that the turkey flavor is diluted.
Yeah, because by the time you reduce it, it's all salt.
Yeah, exactly. So yes.
What about uncooked fish,
Uncooked fish.
like sushi?
Raw.
Eating uncooked fish. Yeah, you want to be really sure of your supplier. So when I'm going to serve sushi in my home, I go to a Japanese supermarket or fish specialist, and I get sushi grade fish, which has often been frozen, by the way. And we have this feeling that sushi is all and sashimi are all about freshness and so on. But it turns out that that's not necessarily the best thing for fish, and that often, well, freezing properly will actually get rid of parasites that can be a problem in certain kinds of fish. And it also, holding on to the fish for some time allows it to develop flavor that it doesn't have otherwise. I actually just got back from Japan, 10 days in Japan about 10 days ago, and I learned a lot about exactly these things there, that letting fish age and freezing fish under certain circumstances are highly desirable things for really good raw fish. Yes?
What about dry brining? That's a technique I've only heard about the last 18 months or so.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I mean, you don't like wet brining, have you tried dry brining?
Well, dry brining to me is a misnomer. Dry brining I would call salting. And the problem with salting is that it is a dehydrating technique. So where brine, and it gets a little interestingly complicated. With a brine, what happens is that the salt will initially go in to the meat, and at the surface of the meat will draw moisture out, because the concentration of salt is lower in the meat than it is outside. This is high school osmosis. But then at a certain point, things change, because the proteins, once they have been exposed to salt, actually unfold and become more capable of holding water than they were before. So they end up, the meat ends up absorbing water. So if you take a pork chop, for example, and put it in brine, and take it out and blot it off and weigh it every 10 or 15 minutes, initially its weight will go down, and then after about an hour or two, the weight will start to go up, and it just absorbs more and more and more salty water. If you do it though just with salt, then the salt just draws the moisture out, and you end up with a very high concentration of salt in the outer portion of the meat, and then a much drier outer portion of the meat as well. If you dry salt for a period of time and then brush the salt off and let it sit, then the salt can kind of penetrate further and equilibrate, and you don't end up with that unevenness. But I don't think it offers a significant advantage. Yes?
Back to the cooking oil, if I may. How do you tell which oil to use when you're cooking? Like, I know that some have a higher threshold or a
Smoke
higher
point.
or,
Smoke point.
smoke point?
Yeah. So, this is again something that will come out in more detail in a week.
It's not in here?
Actually, some of it is.
Some of it is?
But the experiments I did for this particular column, I did about a month ago, which was after I finished writing the book. So, essentially, olive oil and all the standard vegetable oils and seed oils and so on, fresh out of the bottle, have about the same smoke point. Because the smoke point is basically determined by, in oils, the quality of the oil itself. If it is fresh, if it has not started to break down and oxidize, then it's pretty stable, and you can heat it to 450. All of those oils, some of them up to 500 before they begin to smoke. The other side of the story, though, is that the moment you open those bottles, or if the bottles are clear and they've been on a supermarket shelf exposed to fluorescent light and warmth cause oils to degrade. And especially when you open the oil and expose it to the air, it begins to degrade further. And so the smoke point from that same container a week later is going to be lower, simply from having sat on the shelf. And so it's a real argument for buying small containers, not big. They seem like a great bargain, but in fact, by the time you end up using it, most of it will have been rancid. And it turns out that not only is the smoke point lower, the stuff that gets created in this oxidation process, which you can smell, it smells like stale oil. Those are toxic compounds. They're not good for us. And so there's a health reason, not just an aesthetic reason, to use fresh oils and to use small quantities and wrap them in foil. You know, if they're clear bottles, protect them from the light, keep them in a dark place and a cool place. It's important.
Do you get anything with refrigeration?
It turns out, I think with seed oils, probably refrigeration does help. With olive oil, it turns out actually to make things worse. And it's again, slightly complicated chemistry, but what happens is that when it's cold, you know how you'll get a kind of haze in the oil, and that's because the fat molecules are forming crystals. When that happens, everything else that's in the oil gets more concentrated, including the bad stuff. And because the bad stuff is now more concentrated, it has a faster effect on degrading what oil is still there. And so it ends up accelerating the degradation. So, that's why I say that if you're going to give explanations for what's going on, you really have to do your homework, because I never would have guessed that. And I would have said refrigeration always helps everything stay better longer. That makes perfect sense. But if you go to the scientific literature and say, has someone tested this and what have they found? The answer is yes, they've tested it, and they found something completely different from what I expected.
So then
Is that
if you
also
make it-
true of something, especially oil like sesame oil, that learned many years ago that once it's opened, you better refrigerate?
Well, sesame oil and peanut oil are both interesting because you can get them both in several different versions. You can get refined and unrefined. You can get toasted and untoasted. So it turns out that toasted sesame oil is extremely stable, and you can keep that at room temperature, and it won't go bad. But fresh sesame oil, and especially unrefined sesame oil, are very sensitive to oxidation, as are the unrefined versions of peanut oil and other nut oils. Walnut oil, hazelnut oil, they're all wonderful flavors, but they go bad very quickly.
So you should keep those refrigerated, doing the buying in a small quantity.
That's right. But olive oil is the exception. Don't refrigerate olive oil. And you had a follow-up.
Well, so now if I'm making vinaigrette, that you wanna, a batch that you wanna refrigerate. And I know a lot of times you use a part vegetable oil and part olive oil so it doesn't congeal in the refrigerator. Does the vinegar and so forth help it, or is it still degrading?
Yeah, no, I'm afraid the vinegar, because it's very acidic, is gonna make it worse.
Makes it even worse?
Yeah.
Okay.
So it is handy to pre-make a batch and keep it on hand, but and you're not going to notice in something that strong flavored, you're not going to notice a flavor change. So maybe practically speaking, it's not that big a deal, but what's actually happening, big deal or not, is that the oil is breaking down faster because of the acid.
I have a question about potatoes. Baking potatoes, russets. When you peel them and they're green, I usually throw the whole potato out. Is that the right thing to do? Or?
Yeah, again, very good question, and you'd think that that's such a basic question that people would have answered it definitively long ago. So maybe 2 years ago or 3 years ago, someone actually looked at the concentration of the toxic compound that's created when potatoes turn green. And that's why you want to be careful with green potatoes, is that the greenness is a sign that they've been exposed to warm temperatures and to light, and that triggers the potato into making defensive compounds to discourage creatures like us from eating them. And for a long time it was thought that, and there are historical instances of whole populations, towns, in famine times eating green potatoes, and there being severe mortality, lots and lots of people dying as a result. So for a long time it's been assumed that you should peel very deeply or just throw the whole potato out. But 2 or 3 years ago somebody did the experiment of actually checking to see what the levels of these compounds is in potatoes that are more or less green, and what they found is that they're not that high, and that it's not such an important thing to worry about. So as long as you peel it so that you don't see any green, what's left is fine.
I see that in the markets, they are exposed to light,
Yeah.
tremendous amount of light, which probably is the cause of.
Yeah, it's a combination of light, temperature, and time. And the worst instances I've seen have been in, well, in fact, the worst I can remember were from back in the early days of, produce co-ops, where you'd work a few hours a week and get a break on the price of these vegetables, and some of the potatoes that we used to get in the 70s were bright green and tremendously bitter, and not good for you. Yes.
Your opinion on cuisine moléculaire, etc.
Yeah.
What brings?
Right, molecular cuisine, molecular cooking, this experimental stuff that's going on. So I have to admit to being partly responsible for one of the terms that this is called by, molecular gastronomy, which I think is a horrific term, one of the most unappetizing terms ever devised. And it refers to people who are essentially using laboratory equipment and industrial ingredients to make strange-looking foods, foods that people have not experienced before. And I prefer to call it experimental cooking, because I think that's really much more descriptive of what's going on. No cook is thinking about molecules, I guarantee it. So they're thinking about ingredients. And it seems to me that even though it sounds and seems like strange stuff, it's actually exactly what we should expect to be seeing these days. Because if you think about it, traditional cuisines like French and Italian and Spanish and Chinese and Japanese, all these wonderful, very distinctive cuisines developed exactly because these populations were isolated from each other. They had a limited set of ingredients to work with, and so they got really good at extracting the best from them in various ways. And they developed specific techniques. They had more or less access to heat, and so they developed methods based on the availability of fuel. And they had thousands of years to really perfect things because they were isolated from each other. Nowadays, any chef anywhere in the country can get any ingredient from any country FedEx to them overnight. We've got books galore on practically every cuisine known to man. And people are really curious. We all want to experience these things. And so what's happened is that the really creative chefs these days are not interested in kind of honing French or Italian or Japanese cuisine yet one more infinitesimal step. They want to explore this new world, and they want to find out what it is that you can do with these ingredients and techniques that other people haven't thought of before. And so that's what this experimental cooking is about. And science is a useful tool to these people, but it's only a sideshow, really. It's something that they use for the purpose of exploring what it's possible to do that hasn't been done before.
But this brings the definition of good flavor.
Yes.
Much more complicated.
Yes.
How do we define if something is better than something else?
Yeah.
Is there any attempt to use chromatography to define if flavor is 3.4 or
Yeah. Well,
that's what we are aiming at.
Yeah. It's a really interesting time to have any interest at all in the food, because there is these things raise exactly that kind of question. What is quality? Yeah. What is the basis for liking something and not liking something? Is it just prejudice because we're used to this, and this is so strange that we don't know what to make of it? Can we be open-minded about it? Or is it this thing that was just invented in a kitchen that looks like a laboratory? Does it really taste awful? Which it sometimes does. I've had a lot of meals at places like this because it's a very interesting development, and I want to keep up on what's happening. And a lot of it is not very good. But I think that's also predictable, understandable, because French and Japanese and Chinese and Italian cooking have had thousands of years to develop the flavors that we've come to love and expect. These guys have been doing this for maybe 10, so it'll be a while before we know what sticks and what doesn't. Yeah.
Can you give a couple examples of experimental cuisine?
Yeah. Let's see. Yeah, there are all kinds of suggestions. Yeah. Let me give you one. Two or three, or maybe more. The godfather of this movement is a man named Ferran Adrià, who is Catalan, not Spanish, Catalan, and the same area that Salvador Dali came from, and Joan Miró, and other interesting innovators. Gaudí, the architect, and he has done things like this. He'll look at ravioli, and he'll say, okay, ravioli, that's a package. It's got something inside it, and it's got a sauce on the outside, and it's tasty, and lots of people like it. But what can I do with that idea that hasn't been done before? So he looks at it and he says, okay, the package it's a package, but it's kind of boring. It's this paste of flour and water. It's opaque, doesn't have much color unless you color it with spinach or something like that. So I'm going to make a ravioli that's going to be transparent. And I'm going to make a ravioli that is that you can make with almost any flavor that you want, a very concentrated flavor, so that it is you can now see what's inside it as well as the sauce on top of it, and it has a flavor that it brings to the dish. and it isn't as supported by the sauce on the inside. So he made a dish which he called Consummate Raviolis, using, instead of flour, a mixture of gelatin and agar-agar. And agar-agar is best known in the West as the material for petri dishes for growing bacteria in laboratories. But before it was used in the laboratory, it was used in the Far East, in China, in Japan, in Indonesia, as a gelling agent. It comes from seaweeds, and they used it the way we would use starch. So it has a long history there in cooking, and it was adapted by scientists in Germany during a very hot summer when their gelatin petri dishes were all melting. So it came from the kitchen. So Ferran Adrià takes a mixture of gelatin and agar, and he's able to make flexible sheets that he can turn into ravioli packages, and then he'll take a little dab of tomato, for example, and put it inside. And I have slides of this. It doesn't sound so interesting when I describe it in words, but if you look at the dish, it looks like a set of jewels on the plate, because you've got transparent wrappers around bright red on the inside, and then dots of green from a pesto sauce around it. It's gorgeous. And the wrappers are intensely flavored with consomme, with a veal stock or a beef stock or a chicken stock, or whatever it is you want. So it's beautiful and delicious, both. That to me is the best use of this kind of experimental approach, is taking a fresh look at something and saying, how can I make this more interesting than it is? He doesn't pass judgment on ravioli, the standard ravioli. He's just saying, that's a wonderful thing, wonderful invention, but this is the 21st century, I want to do something different. Another example is that you can use a small tabletop machine these days, essentially to extract the aromas from foods and concentrate them down. It's a distillation apparatus, and essentially what you do is you heat the ingredient, and the aromas come off because you heated it, and then you have a way of trapping those aromas and collecting them. So you can take anything, heat it, and collect its aroma. And so there are other chefs in Spain who have specialized in this, and they do things like they'll serve you a dish that's got what looks like a lemon sorbet and a lemon ice cream, all colorless things, a jelly with no color, a custard with no color, just white. So it all looks very homogeneous and as if it were made of nothing but something that doesn't have a lot of color. But you take a bite, and one of them tastes like chocolate, one of them tastes like coffee, another one tastes like passion fruit, because what he's done is take those ingredients, extract the aromas into concentrates, and then put them into materials, jellies and ices and so on, where there is no color, and so you have no visual clue as to what the flavor is going to be. And so the disconnect, when you put it in your mouth, is shocking. And chefs like to do this, not just for the sake of shock value, but just, we do get used to foods. We do become complacent about foods, and we don't really experience them freshly if we're too used to them. So this is a way of getting you to really pay attention to what chocolate tastes like, because you're getting it completely by surprise. So those are two examples of the best uses of this experiment.
What about verjus? Are you familiar with it, and what do you know about it?
So verjus is it's short for green juice, and it's the unripe grape juice.
Or crab apples?
Yeah, it's true. You can make it. Originally, it was a great product, but people have now used the same idea to refer to tart juices made from unripe fruits of all kinds, and it is a very nice.
Safety and so on of it, there's no problem.
Well, it depends on how it's been prepared, of course, but there's nothing wrong with the use of unripe juices in small quantities as a kind of flavoring. You wouldn't want to drink a lot of it. Yes.
How do they prepare the foams? You hear a lot of, as far as other
Right.
cooking,
Yeah.
you hear a lot of foam.
Yeah, so Ferran Adrià's signature invention is the foam. Before him, the foam, a foam in the kitchen, professional kitchen, was something that you wanted to avoid and that you threw away. You would scoop it off and throw it away. And then he thought about it completely differently again, and then tried to make foams out of all kinds of ingredients. And basically what you can do is make stable foams out of any liquid just by adding a little bit of lecithin. That's, and then whip with the lecithin, and the lecithin will stabilize the bubbles. But his first one was actually a carrot foam. He, I think, was just blending carrots and discovered by accident, because he left the blender on too long or something, that it foamed tremendously. And then he turned it off, and 10 minutes later the foam was still there. And he thought, maybe I can do something with this. Yeah.
You were talking about earlier, like salt will boil the water out, and dry something out. But like salt's a rock. So when you like season your steak and grill it, a lot of times you buy a steak seasoner, or you make like some kind of chimichurri, you baste it, you marinate it.
Mm-hmm.
When you grill it, would it be better to season a piece of meat after you grill it, so it wouldn't burn what you seasoned, like your marinade or something?
Mm-hmm.
I always wondered that. Is it better to season before or after salt, pepper, what the whole process would be?
Yeah, yeah. So seasoning steaks and things before or after cooking, especially grilling, which is high temperature, so I would give different answers for the different ingredients that you mentioned: oil, herbs and spices, salt and pepper. On a grill where the temperatures are very high, you are going to burn anything that can burn, and so that includes herbs and spices, black pepper included. And black pepper can get really acrid. If you get a nice toasty aroma if you cook black pepper in a pan just very gently. It's actually a really nice way to get an added flavor note from black pepper that you don't ordinarily get. Just toast it for like a minute in a pan, no oil, just in the pan itself. You end up with a nice toasty flavor. But on a grill, it gets burned, scorched, and then you do get this kind of bitterness that's not nice at all. But salt is, again, a different story. You might think, salt draws moisture out, and you want to keep the moisture in a piece of meat, so maybe you shouldn't put the salt on before the cooking, because it's going to draw the juices out and make it even drier. The fact that chefs argue about that point, I think, indicates that it doesn't really matter. Because if it really did make a difference, then the difference would be obvious to every professional and probably every home cook as well, and we would just do it one way. So my sense is that salting before cooking is actually a good thing, because even if it does draw moisture out, that means you're going to end up with a more flavorful surface. Because if you think what happens as you're cooking a piece of meat, the juices begin to come out, but the high heat vaporizes the water before it has a chance to drip off. And when it vaporizes the water, all the flavorful stuff that was in those juices gets stuck to the surface of the meat, just stops there. The more juices that come out, the more you're going to end up with that wonderful browned coating on the outside. Self-basting, maybe I'll have to think about that one. Self-basting.
And
Yes.
now you are going to tell us about the chemist that changed the way we cook meat.
Ah.
I've not forgotten.
Okay. The chemist.
Who was he?
Yeah, the chemist who changed the way we cook meat. This is, for me, a wonderful example of the fact that chemists know a lot, but cooks know a lot too. And sometimes they they give in to chemists and think that the chemists know more than they do, when in fact it's the other way around. So in the middle of the 19th century, there was a chemist by the name of Justus Liebig, German chemist, yeah, and very important figure in the history of chemistry. He did a lot of really good stuff, but he took an interest in nutrition, and he came up with a theory that the most nourishing part of a piece of meat was its juices, and that if you for example, squeezed a piece of meat and were able to get all the juices out, the fiber that was left, you should just throw it away. It was useless. We now know that's where all the protein is in the fibers. So he was wrong on that score to begin with. But he then thought, okay, keeping the juices is important. So either you want to make a soup where you cut the meat very fine, extract the juices out into the soup, throw away the pieces of meat that remain because they've lost all their juices, and then enjoy the soup. And in fact, he came up with a business, the Liebig Meat Extract Company, which lasted well into this century. Or if you're going to roast or cook a piece of whole meat, you want to cook it in such a way as to keep all the juices inside the meat. And so, without doing any experiments, he just stated that you could do this by cauterizing the outside of the meat, by heating it to a very high temperature, which would seal the surfaces and prevent the juices from coming out. So I gave a talk years ago to the Confederation of Canadian Chefs in Winnipeg, and there was a sea of white jackets and toques out there, and I asked for a show of hands, how many of you agree that searing a piece of meat seals in the juices, which is the modern version of Liebig's theory? And almost all the hands went up. And then I put a picture up on the screen of a steak that had been blackened on the outside, sitting on a plate. It had been cooked to medium rare, and anyone who has ever cooked a steak to medium rare knows what happens once you take it off the grill and put it on a plate. The way you know that it's medium rare is that these little beads of juice begin to appear on the surface of the meat and to collect on the plate. So I then showed a picture of a blackened steak on a plate with a puddle of juices around it. And I asked how many people have seen this in their professional careers. And, hands slowly started to go up. And then I asked, how many of you now believe that searing a piece of meat seals in the juices? No hands. So every cook experiences the disproof of this theory, and yet we still hear it on TV shows and see it in magazines. And before Liebig, the way you cooked a piece of meat was to, a roast in particular, was to start it far away from the fire to begin with, and then when it was almost done, you brought it very close and you browned it at the very end, so that by the time it got to the table, it was still bubbling hot on the outside. And after Liebig, you can see this in the cookbooks, which would come out in multiple editions. The pre-Liebig edition would say, cook it that way. Post-Liebig would say, the subtitle of the book was now, in which the principles of Baron Liebig are explained and applied. And they now give the modern sear the meat to seal of the juices. So, one guy had an amazing impact. Yeah. Yes?
I think you've gotten involved in something like this recently about a burger flipping.
Right.
Is that you?
Yes.
And everyone says flip a burger once, but you think differently.
Well,
I'm not sure
burgers, yeah. Burgers I don't want to flip very often because they're delicate. When they're properly made, they're delicate, and you don't want to handle them too much or they're going to fall apart. But a steak or a chop, turns out the more frequently you flip it, the better. And I found that out, and again, it's kind of, I never would have guessed that without doing the experiment. I was working with some friends who are in the silicon chip business. So they fabricate chips for computers, and they heat the silicon to very high temperatures for that, and so they have to model heat transfer to really understand what's going on. So they had software that would essentially show them what happens when you apply heat of a certain degree to a slab of material, and you could watch the heat travel into the material. So these friends of mine who loved cooking said, you know, we could adapt that software and use it to model what goes on when you cook steaks. And I thought, great. So we did this, and then it turned out around the same time the editor of Physics Today asked me to write an article for the journal. And so we thought, okay, we're going to write about modeling heat transfer on a computer. And so we developed a program, we did all kinds of fun things with it, but then we realized at some point that, you know, we could have this machine also test things like flipping frequency. You know, does it make a difference whether you flip it once or more than once? And so we ran some simulations, the kind of thing that I would never do in real life, right? Stand there flipping steaks all the time and measuring the temperature would be very difficult to do. But we had the computer do it, and what we found was if you flip, the more frequently you flip a piece of meat, the faster it cooks, and significantly faster, and the more evenly done it is when it's done. So it takes much less time, and you end up with a much more evenly done piece of meat. So we got this result, and it was true if you flipped the steak every 5 seconds, that was best. Almost as fast as you could flip was best. So we thought this was a strange result, but you know, we gave it a try. I got some steaks, I cut them exactly to the same thickness, put a thermocouple probe in the center, and stood there and essentially confirmed what the computer told us, that the more frequently you flip, the evener and the faster the meat cooks.
It's like a rotisserie.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So it's the steak version of a rotisserie, and it's essentially the way it works is that whenever the piece of meat is facing the heat on a rotisserie or in a pan or on a grill, that side is heating up to a very high temperature while the other side is staying cold or cooling down. And so the more often you flip it, the less time you have to overcook that side and the less time you allow that side to cool down. So you don't have to heat that side up as much, and this one doesn't get overheated. The result is that you end up with this really even heating.
But isn't there a problem when you do that as opposed to letting one side cook for just a few minutes? Then it doesn't stick to the pan when you flip it right away.
Okay, so
So how do you?
yeah, so if you're working in a pan that has sticking issues, yes, that's, you have to take that into consideration. Yeah. Yeah, but if you're flipping every few seconds, it never gets a chance to stick in the first place. So.
If you have a lot of oil in it, there's some oil.
No, not necessarily. Yeah. It's, I always recommend experimenting, because you always find things out that are new and interesting, and sometimes a better way to do things.
I want to talk about the way to cook eggs. That was interesting on the article interview. I think about cooking eggs. Not
To
raising.
interject,
Does
but
he
we have
need
time
to go?
for just one or two more questions.
Okay.
About not getting the temperature. Talk about getting the temperature very high.
Well, it depends on what you're trying to do with them, but it's very true. One of the wonderful things that's happened as a result of the rediscovery of the science of cooking is that we now have at least a hope for cooking foods at precise temperatures, which is something that's been pretty much impossible until very recently. Laboratories have had water baths that are, you know, very well controlled and calibrated for decades. Cooking is essentially taking ingredients and adding heat, and sometimes the amount of heat you add is really critical, and we haven't been able to control that precisely until recently with immersion circulators, water ovens. They're called various things, but water baths whose temperature you can control very well. And what chefs discovered once they had this tool in their arsenal was, before this came along, we had kind of soft-boiled eggs and hard-cooked eggs, and slight variations in between. But they found it makes a difference if you cook an egg to 140 degrees and 142 degrees. There's a detectable difference, and 144 degrees, detectable difference. Within the range in which the yolk and the white set, you get very, very different textures, almost degree by degree. And some of those textures are such that, for example, at the right temperature, I forget exactly what it is, maybe 147 or 48, the yolk has a consistency that is neither soft nor hard, and you can roll it out like a pastry dough and fold it around things and make shapes with it. It's almost like a Play-Doh consistency. So you can do things with the egg yolk at that particular temperature that you can't do, and that cooks didn't know about because there was no way to get that texture before. So it's a roundabout way to say that yes, the temperature at which you cook eggs is important, but it depends on what you're looking for. Okay, one more.
Do you have an interest in food trends, not so much cooking? For example, you and I were probably both in LA about the same time when we were at Caltech, and I will think, when did stores suddenly get cilantro? And then why are Chipotle is the ingredient of the 21st century? Now, certainly cilantro has been everywhere for thousands of years, but not in Pasadena, not in San Fernando Valley. But when, who's writing about trends like that? I don't know.
There are people who have been writing about that. There's one book called, I think, The United States of Arugula, which is worth taking a look at. The names are not occurring to me at the moment. There's several people who've written about the sudden flowering of the American interest in food very happily for me, coinciding with about the time that I started to write my books. And I think it just had to do with this, the fact that it became so much easier to know what else was going on out there, travel, transportation of ingredients, information technologies. It's all made this transformation of the food world possible. Anyway.
Well, thank you very much.